Hello and welcome, everyone. Today, we are gathered here to discuss a very important issue, not only because it's technically trending in this nation, but because it's something that is affecting a lot of the work that we all do. We'll get into the concepts and foundations and a little bit of history of what's going on here. But today, we'll be discussing critical race theory during the Trump and post-Trump era, if we can actually call it that yet. But today I'm joined by a wonderful group of individuals who will be talking about their experience with critical race theory, why we should defend it, why it's important, how it affects education as a whole, and other experiences that we want to discuss. My name is Chris Macias. I am the National Director of Personnel for Save the Kids. Um, and I'm joined here by Anthony Nocella, who will also introduce himself for Save the Kids.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Nocella. I'm with Save the Kids. And we'll be discussing today critical race theory as it's been discussed recently throughout the news by military leaders, politicians, and what does that look like if it was actually passed into law that we cannot speak about critical race theory, right? Save the Kids is a fully volunteer grassroots national organization, 501c3, with 6 chapters throughout the country and a number of wonderful programs. Some of those programs include the Punk Studies Journal and Annual Conference, the Lowrider Studies Journal and Annual Conference, the Transformative Justice Journal and Annual Conference, and a number of other events, including the National Week of Action Against Incarcerating Youth. So again, thank you so much. We're putting theory to practice today from the foundations of people like Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, and so many other amazing critical and radical pedagogues throughout the world. And so we're having a discussion today with some beautiful people, and we want to critique as our speakers began today before this was recorded to discuss the foundations of neoliberalism, but then also beyond neoliberalism, how do we get to a place of challenging concepts and theories and specifically critical thinking, right? So what is on the chopping block is critical thinking, and a subset of that is critical race theory. So without any further ado, I'll pass it on to Chris to introduce the amazing speakers throughout the country that have beautiful roles.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anthony. To reiterate, critical race theory is a difficult concept to define, but we understand what it is as educators. And the folks here have done work directly and indirectly around this topic, right? So critical race theory, if I were to define it in one phrase, it would be the study of systemic racism, specifically to this country, specifically to historical concepts and how it affects us. And so these folks will be speaking definitely more about that in detail and be answering questions. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Guillermo Aviles Rodriguez, the doctoral candidate on School of Theater, Film, and Television in UCLA. Guillermo is an assistant professor of theater and cinema at Los Angeles Mission College and the artistic director of Watts Village Theater Company. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Utah and a Master's of Fine Arts from UC San Diego. Guillermo grew up in Watts and holds the distinction of being the first Chicanao ever to star in main stage production at the University of Utah. Some of Guillermo's directorial and literary highlights include 2 commissions from Center Theater Group to write student discovery guides for En Un Sol Amarillo and Culture Clashes Palestine, New Mexico. So welcome, Guillermo.
Great. Thank you so much. Great to be here. The most important part of all that is that I did graduate from the University of Utah. So I'm so happy to be virtually back home.
Joining us all the way from California. Thank you, Guillermo. Next, we have Dr. Daniel Cairo, who is the Special Assistant to the Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at his institution. Dr. Cairo, he, him, his, L pronouns, has over 10 years experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion as an educator and organizational leader. His areas of expertise include EDI leadership, social justice education, intergroup dialogue, neoliberalism, interpersonal violence and prevention education, first-generation student engagement, student development, and student success, to name a few. Dr. Cairo holds a Doctor of Education in Higher Education Administration. His doctoral research was titled The Corporatization of Student Affairs, Student Success in Neoliberal Times. He also holds a minor degree in ethnic studies, a bachelor in mass communication, and a master's in educational leadership and policy, and a master's of education in instructional leadership from Chicago. So welcome, Dr. Cairo. Our third panelist is Dr. Michael Benitez Jr., Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Metropolitan State University of Denver. Michael Benitez recently joined MSU Denver in September as Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion over the past 2 decades. Benitez has served higher education in different capacities, including academic and student affairs, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and teaching. He is a nationally acclaimed scholar, practitioner in higher ed, and a highly sought speaker and workshop leader at universities, colleges, and conferences nationwide. Benitez has authored books, chapters, and articles on student identity, hip hop culture, cultural events, cultural centers, faculty development, cultural ethnic studies, and campus climate assessment. He has been featured in educational documentaries such as Cracking the Codes, The System of Racial Inequity, 2012, and on talk shows such as Hard Knock Radio and Speak Out with Tim Wise. He is co-editor of the anthology Crash Course, Reflections on the Film Crash, or critical dialogues about race, power, and privilege. His most recent works on supporting faculty of color, creating campus community participatory frameworks for difficult conversations and institutional action can be found in AACU's Liberal Education and New Directions in Institutional Research. Prior to joining MSU Denver, Benitez served as Chief Diversity Officer for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Puget, Sound Director of Intercultural Leadership and Engagement at Lafayette College, Director of Diversity Initiatives at Dickinson College, and Camp Retention and Academic Counselor at Penn State University. He has helped create, shape, and lead innovative equity and inclusion-based strategies, programs, and practices to address some of higher education's more pressing campus climate issues and challenges. Such programs include inclusive teaching conversations, the diversity monologues, the campus climate community participatory frameworks, and the NW5C cross-institutional consortium for supporting faculty of color. Benitez completed his BS and MED at Pennsylvania State University, where he gained interest in pursuing doctoral studies as a McNair Scholar. He holds a PhD in educational leadership and policy from Iowa State University School of Education and has been recognized with several leadership and scholarly awards throughout his career. So welcome, Dr. Benitez. So as you can see, this is a wonderful group of experienced folks. And Michael, I don't know if you'd like to add something as well.
Nah, man, thanks for that dope intro. First, just recognizing my people, so Arapaho and Cheyenne people in the land on which I sit, and then bordering, obviously, shout out to the Utes and some of the other nations, and introduce myself in my native tongue, Usa, Wayu, Watiao Didi, Mike B, son of the land of Borinquen. That's all, Chris. Thanks, man.
Thank you all so much. For the audience members who are present here today, I'd like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded, that you are welcome to put comments and questions in the chat. We will get to them as we facilitate, as we go. And I'd also like to mention and disclose the diversity or lack of diversity in this particular group. I do want to mention that all attempts from the organization Save the Kids were made to reach to as many folks as possible to join this conversation. And these are the wonderful folks who responded and were willing to provide some time and expertise in that. And so we do realize that we are missing different voices at this table. And so we want to just say that this is going to be one or several perspectives that don't necessarily reflect everything, but we want to continue the conversation. This is only step one. So thank you for all of that. So without further ado, let's talk about critical race theory. Without any particular order, whoever would like to begin, please tell us how critical race theory has been present in your life, how you use it in your research, and where have you been using it, first of all, to give us some background. Thank
you. All right, man. I'll go ahead and hop on, so we all don't, fight to get onto the mic at once. So, real talk. Critical race theory is not something that I think consciously has been in my life by way of knowing what it was. It's something that I really learned or started to learn about in grad school. But I've been an activist since I was probably 14, 15 years old. So I've always practiced anti-racism. I just didn't have the language to mark what it is that I was practicing, right? How I was challenging systems of racism and other forms of oppression. But today, CRT, I lean more on the work of a George Sefadeh, and his work on anti-racism. If you're familiar with him, he's a Canadian scholar out of Ghana, real dope elder. But when the context of the U.S., critical race theory is something that I apply, use as a theoretical framework for analysis and as a way of engaging practice that allows us to center the voices of the racially oppressed and ostracized and the conditions in this country. So even for those of us who are not familiar with CRT, if we are challenging systems of oppression, we are practicing CRT.
I can plug in, and thank you, Michael. I can plug in and jump in on that. I think mostly, I really appreciate the practice component, right? Mostly because a lot of us are not going around and saying like, I'm going to do CRT right now, right? And we start naming it. It is now embedded, especially embedded in the work that I do, but also in the way in which I move through the world. I am very grateful to have had professors in my undergraduate career who started using that framework to teach about history, to teach about race, right? To teach about the value of bringing your experiences in your story and how that contributes as a counter narrative to what we were fed as you know, in K through 12. And so, yeah, CRT is a theoretical framework mostly taught in graduate school, but I consider myself lucky to have experienced it in the classroom as an undergraduate, right? Bits and pieces as to what would it be. And so it's been an important framework for my research, right? So I need to come out and say I'm not a critical race scholar, but it is a framework that definitely informs the ways in which I critique neoliberalism, the ways in which we think about both the student experience and also what it means to belong on a campus, right? So I think CRT, yes, it's again, theory, but it's also a method. It's a method that a lot of us now have used to talk about systems of oppression, the way that we talk about, you know, again, belonging and what does it mean to be a person with minoritized identities, right, in existing in higher education, and to be able to have some of that language.
Great. You know, my first experience with what I would later identify as critical race theory happened in my teenage years, because I grew up in Watts, and Watts is famous for, you know, burning itself down every 10 years, and drugs and gangs. And so I grew up with that very present in my upbringing. And then I went off to school and I learned that the co-discoverer of plutonium grew up, went to school in Watts. Glenn T. Seaborg is his name. And it shook me that here was a legitimate example of positive, you know, sort of contributions to science, and a kid who had grown up in Watts had never heard of him. And so it made me think, like, what other stories do we own that are being maybe ignored, maybe consciously hidden? And I started looking, and in that process of searching, I discovered the work that is now called critical race theory, a sort of searching for positive contributions that have come from people who have been signed off, written off, you know, as liabilities. And so that was my first introduction. And then I decided to chase that down, and I went to Cuba and I studied. I was going, you know, in my youth, I was going to move there and begin the work of doing what at the time I just thought was, you know, work, but today can be called critical race theory. And so then that was the second sort of generation of my coming into being. And we should note that, you know, critical race theory has its roots going way back to the 60s, but really it got rolling in the 90s, right? And so in many ways, I was sort of positioned to absorb that constant shift that's still going on, because it's not a, you know, frozen picture. It's really flowing. And then finally, then I took that work and took it into my work in the media, because I think that the media is one of the main places where that, for lack of a better word, the manipulation of perception happens, where you can convince people who have a legacy of, you know, mathematics and astronomy that they're no good at math, you know, through the sort of conditioning. In any event, that's the door into this type of work that I experienced. And then, as I will talk about later, I also worked a lot in prisons, California State prison system. And that was very interesting, coming off of teaching in high school, going to prisons and seeing the faces that looked very similar.
Very interesting perspectives from all of you, and especially considering just the regions that we're at, right? Right now, we're all kind of in similar regions, but still very different. I mean, California, Denver, Utah, right? Things can definitely vary quite a bit there. So I think just having that background and those stories told says that this sort of theory or this sort of knowledge is rampant throughout and exists throughout our society. It's just how we experience it has been a little bit different. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. So let's get into it a little bit more and how the actual theory is present in our schools. Can you tell us, again, whoever would like to begin, how critical race theory benefits or empowers all students, specifically how it empowers students of color, and then on the other side, how it also works to empower white students, as we would say.
I'll start with this part, right? That for when thinking about, students of color, students with, marginalized identities, minoritized, right? When the tools that when we use tools in our pedagogy, right, that really allow students to see themselves in positive ways, where we affirm who they are, when we validate their experience, right, when we validate their cultures, that does something for them, and that actually allows them to engage in an educational experience that affirms them, and where learning actually becomes I think learning becomes exciting, right? Learning becomes eye-opening, right? When we can start to name not only how they're empowered, but also how they're disempowered, right? And it's I think it's validating. And so we know that when they're affirmed, when we name systems of oppression, when we name the history of colonialism, the history of violence, so that we say, listen, this is, you may be experiencing generational poverty, right? And this is what it looks like. This is what language might be. You may be experiencing, microaggressions in the playground or in your college classroom, right? And being able to give people language to name that phenomenon, to name that experience. We know that it increases test scores. We know that it increases belonging, right? We know that it actually helps them build community. And so I think that the way that it benefits students of color is that they do better in schools when we're actually talking about the reality of racism, when we're talking about the other intersections, right? Classism, sexism, and transphobia, and how those things show up.
And I'm glad you mentioned intersecting identities, because even though in the title it says critical race theory, we know that we cannot take that out of someone's identity and say, this is how it only affects your life, or how your life is impacted by one thing, right? That's kind of where it starts when they first coined critical race theory, to talk about that racism and race issues are endemic to our society. However, we must acknowledge why all of these other factors have to come into play with all of that. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
Since we're mentioning it, I think let's name some of that credit, right? Kimberly Crenshaw, who gave us the lens of intersectionality. She is one of the early scholars of critical race theory who was able to say, listen, something's happening in this legal system where the intersections of oppression are disenfranchising the most vulnerable, right? They're disenfranchising Black women. And what does that mean to be able to name those pieces? So that it's both on, yes, the intersections of how we experience the world, but it's about naming oppression, how that oppression disenfranchises people, and how it's actually methodical, right? How it's structural, and how it is by design.
Do the other panelists have responses or answers to the original question?
Yeah, no, I'll go ahead and chime in. Since we brought up some of the tenets, it's so important to mark those particular tenets. If I was to look at critical race, the things that critical race does, and props, shout out Derek Bell, who's really the one that right began to put critical race theory on the map as a response to legal jurisprudence. which is the way that laws were being formulated to particularly tax and oppress and keep to the margins, not only people of color, but to the point of those intersecting identities. In particular, when you account for gender construction, sex, class, and others. But what it does is it places racism in the broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest. So the idea of interest convergence alongside, counter narrative storytelling. Although to keep it real, I think that the counter narrative is what people see as the dominant narrative. My narrative is the narrative. It's my standard narrative. I don't go into places seeking to belong. I go into places seeking to reclaim. and so let's I just want to be real about that. It also seeks to dismantle racial oppression in all its forms, right? And it challenges how race and racial power are constructed and represented, particularly in American culture and society, right? And what I want to relate to people is that, this theory emerged out of the reality that there was a legal formulation of exclusionary laws that basically said, hey, white people, y'all could advance all y'all want. Hey, black and brown people and other, people, y'all can advance. And if you try to legally, we could arrest you. If you try to advance and do things that are only relegated to whiteness, then, we could actually, you could get in trouble for it, right? And so it's so important to outline those tenets. And then I'll add that critical race theory challenges liberalism and this sort of claims of neutrality, right? This idea that, hey, I don't see race, or it's all about human beings, and I don't care if you're pink or brown or yellow. It's like, yo, if you see somebody that's pink or yellow or green, let me know. I want to meet them too, I've never met somebody green or pink, but anytime somebody talks about color blindness or say they don't see color, that's why I always carry a stack of optometry cards. Man, I know a great eye doctor that could help out with that color blindness in case people, have it. But it also challenges, in particular, this idea of racial identity by constructing whiteness as a property, right? All these tenets are important to highlight in CRT. And the idea that whiteness was constructed as having a certain value in this nation that gets you places in ways that not being white or identifying as white or coming across as white won't give you the privilege. And I think that's why there is so much uproar. And then lastly, I'll add that critical race theory truly challenges power and dominance. And that's what CRT is really all about. It's that framework that says, hey, if we look at it this way, we see that there's inequities in power balance. So it does get at the neoliberalism and the neocolonialism and the construction of the norm, the standard by which we all base our lives around, whereas CRT puts self and the identities of self as the expertise and the standard as the analysis for how we walk life, right? So for example, if I'm looking at myself and I'm in school and I'm seeing that history has 3 pages of Latinx or Black history or whatever that looks like, I'm flipping that, right? I'm saying, okay, I'm gonna do 10 pages on what people understand as the standard of American history. And then I'm gonna do the other 90 pages on the Black and brown contributions and experiences within the context of American culture. So all those tenets are so important to highlight as a foundation for understanding CRT and the way that CRT led to Lat crit, critical race feminism, Asian crit, tribe crit, and has really spurred, but it is born out of this global theoretical movement already going on in other places in the world, in Australia, in the continent of Africa, in the continent of Europe, in Canada, that was based on anti-racism as a whole.
Awesome, thank you. I teach in CSUN, California State University, Northridge in the Chicano Studies and Theater Department. And it's maybe 80-20 Latino, Latinx, Latine versus every other white, Asian. So Hispanic serving institution. And when I teach elements, when I borrow from critical race theory, I make sure that I teach all of, I'm glad that Freire came up, because when people read him, they conveniently leave out, often I find, the very important element of his work that says, once you become liberated, do not make the mistake of becoming an oppressor yourself. And I think that that cautionary tale is important to our work, because what our work is uh, drawing its strength from is that we're trying to stop oppression. We're not trying to replace oppression. We're not trying to, as Fox News advertises, put white people in programming camps, right? We have to fight that narrative. And how does that narrative get fought? It's fought by the white students in our classes, knowing that it's not an either or, that it's a yes and, that it doesn't hurt you that the Mayans discovered the zero. That is not, less, you're not less for it. It is a yes and let's celebrate this and build off of it. And so that's important to me. That's to go back to the example of how do white students benefit from this. I think that because the implementation of critical race theory is often antagonistic or zero sum, that we create adversaries where we could have allies sometimes. And I'm just speaking generally from my experience at Northridge, which tends to be a conservative, outside of Chicano studies and the, ethnic studies programs, pretty conservative institution. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because I think that we're playing into the hands of, to go back to the title, the snappy title of this, the Trump, post-Trump era, is that Trump is not a disease. He is a symptom. If I want to highlight this fact that, a lot of us forget, maybe some people don't know, but in 2016, he got 29% of the Latino vote. In 2020, he got 32%. He got more votes, being even more insulting to Latinos. Now, those people are going to be around long past Trump. And so how do we bring them over into our worldview, into our way of seeing things? That's going to take a yes and attitude. And, I have conversations with people who say, well, those are Cubans in Florida. I don't think so. The numbers don't bear out. Those people are your neighbors. Those people are your tío, your tía. And so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because look, we have to look, I think my feeling is we have to look long game. And the long game is that the resistance is going to get more and more violent and strong the more that we make headway, right? Because people are threatened by this worldview. And so we have to be smart and strategic about how we pitch it to the people who are neutral, And so who are those neutral people? It's the white students in your classrooms, but it's also the conservative Latino students in your classroom, of which there are at least 32% nationally. Well, I mean, assuming that the young people are a lot smarter than the older people, I think. But and in general terms, I want to, point us towards the strategic as well as polemic. You need that passion, but you also need the strategy, because believe me, the forces of anti-critical race theory are mobilizing as we speak, and it's in the media, and maybe we can bring some of the examples up later.
Thank you for that. I think all of you made some really critical points, some really important distinctions on how people benefit and who benefits, right? There is, like we said earlier, intersectionality. And so even though I asked the question how it benefits people, students of color, and how it benefits white students, in reality, we're talking about how it benefits all. Now, education needs to have systems, or not systems, theories like these, or educational components that allow us to actually talk about truth, talk about reality, and talk about what Guillermo was mentioning, the long game. What's happening in the long run? What are the implications overall, right? We know that critical race theory only became hot topic politically and in the media recently, but the idea of suppressing and oppressing people of different backgrounds, people of in different class systems, et cetera, has been ongoing in many different ways. It's always being weaponized in different ways. And today, that weapon is called banning critical race theory, right? I've talked to different folks and I've seen some of the studies where a lot of the school districts and school boards throughout the nation have said, we don't even know what critical race theory is. We don't teach critical race theory, and it's something is being banned. So what can we talk about? So what were we doing wrong? And that to me speaks volumes to say you may have been talking about some of these things without necessarily knowing the vocabulary, or you may not have been talking about it at all. And this is the first time you're hearing of it when it's in the negative, right? Critical race theory is bad, when that may or may not be the case after all, right? So based on some of the things you all have said, can you tell us what has led to this point where we are talking about banning something that some institutions have said they don't know what it is? Why are we here today?
See, here's the thing. The thing is that this is not the first time historically in the United States that we have banned books. This is not a new concept. You know, we've banned, you know, books by Bell Hooks, by Alice Walker. We've banned books by Henry Jairou. We've banned books by different, you know, critical, you know, theorists at different moments here in the United States. You know, some states obviously in their K-12 systems more than others. We've never really, you know, taught critical race theory at the middle school level or the high school level, although we should, because it's a theoretical framework of analysis, right? And so, you know, the teachers that are being trained and developed to teach courses like history or different, you know, courses in education, they're the ones that then bring that theoretical framework, no different than other frameworks. But here's the thing, right? Nobody's talking about, even in this case, and just as important, critical whiteness theory and the work of Frankenberg and Ignatieff and the abolitionists and the critical movements. And those are so important to this, because it's not just about examining and using a central point of analysis around people of color or non-white people. This is also about interrogating whiteness and the history of whiteness and the way that whiteness has informed the rest of this social construction. And let me keep it clear for people out there. It doesn't mean white people are bad. It doesn't mean whiteness is a bad thing. No, man. If you look at, you know, lynch hangings from pictures back in the early 1900s, mid 1800s, you see folks lynching somebody and then going and kissing their daughters and sons. Man, so think about that. So you're talking about a people who truly have been taught over time a certain white supremacist superiority, and not white supremacy as in just the KKK, not white supremacy as in the overt, you know, bigoted racism that we've seen reemerge over the last, 5 years or so, really 10 years, because so much of it was a response to people, you know, going AWOL over seeing a Black person in power, such as President Barack Obama. And now let me keep it clear. That's not to say President Obama was innocent neither, because a lot of wrongdoing and injustices happened under President Obama too. You know, what I'm saying is more so that we have to be attentive to this epistemic a notion of how people are taught and show up, and then what it means when they are challenged. So it's not just white supremacy out there. White supremacy is the condition. The bigotry that we see is the action. The white liberal supremacy, altruism among white people that we see, that's the action, right? But supremacy itself is the epistemic disease and condition that leads to people not understanding that. And I throw that out there because I think it's also okay. You know, I'm that cat that could sit in a space and I could, you know, sit across a David Duke. and hear him out, because, you know, it is what it is. And I'm at a place where I can't let that anger me so much, just what he's saying, but to be in that conversation, to demonstrate and exemplify how to, you know, how to challenge that type of thinking and those type of actions, it's what's required here. So all those pieces, you know, matter. And what CRT really does is it allows us to look at the flip side of any given question, right? Instead of saying, oh, why are, you know, Black people, you know, always at the bottom, economically speaking, in poverty? CRT says, what are the systems and the structures and the conditions that are making it so that Black people stay, economically speaking, at the bottom, or for Latinx people to want to embrace an aspect of them that is actually part of them, right? When you look at Latinos, man, whiteness is so real and so deep in Latinx culture too, going back to the 1500s. It's not just the US, you know. And so when people say, oh, this Latino cat is white passing, or this Latino cat looks so white, no, there's a lot of Latinos who identify as white, and they're not white passing, they're white. They just speak Spanish and practice Latino culture, right? But you even look at further migrations from Europe to Latin America, from Germany, from other parts of Europe, of white Europeans who eventually, over time, you know, in the words of Benedict, you know, Anderson, Imagined Communities, if you're familiar, you know, with that book, created these identities that relate to their respective nation state there, so that they have German ancestry, but 2 generations later, their children identify as white in their respective country. They don't really become Latino until they move to the US, and they're like, oh, that's what I am? Well, not really. And so that's why you have such a large portion of Hispanics in the US also mark white as their other identity, as if to be white Hispanic. So this is so complex and nuanced and vital that we teach this as a theoretical framework, exactly, Anthony, for what you said earlier, which is, even if just for critical thinking, right? Even if just to just think critically, think for yourself, think more broadly about the way that systems truly influence and impact the way that we formulate our lives and experiences.
Thank you for that. I'll jump in and say, and you know, I'm going to come out and say it this way, so we'll see how it lands. But I actually don't think this is about CRT, right? I think this is about everything else that's happening right now in the country, right? Whether it, you know, like queer trans folks being more visible and saying, like, you know what, this is our space, we're going to be claiming it, right? There are folks doing racial justice and engaging and, you know, in conversations of anti-racism and dismantling it is clear, evident oppression, right? And they've never read a book about CRT, right? So right now, CRT is the boogeyman, like it was, you know, trans people entering into bathrooms, right? Or, you know, I don't know what it was before that, right? But there's always essentially coming up an issue where people are trying to push against individuals asking for justice, right? And so I think that's an important distinction, because everybody's hanging their hat on the CRT theoretical framework, right? But we're not talking as much of the critiques of neoliberalism. We're not talking about post-colonialism. We're not talking about even postmodernism, right? And so the idea to defend CRT, to me, sometimes we need to name what it is, but it also makes it so that we engage in that conversation when we really should be defending are the values of racial justice, the values of what does it mean to be in community with other people and in solidarity right now. So, I mean, for me, in my discipline and the work that I'm doing, ask people, anyone, what's it like to make a living in this world? What's it like to show up and, you know, be able to work a job, have family, and be able to take care of yourselves? And that's, I think, the divisiveness of this, that, you know, the things that are going on right now that are wrong are not because our government, Obama included, right? They're neoliberal structures that are continuing to squeeze people, some more than others, right? And so instead of addressing some of those issues head on, we are distracting folks with like, well, you know, it's because CRT is teaching kids how to be divisive and feel bad about their whiteness, right? So I would say then it has nothing to do with the framework and everything with what is going wrong, and people are trying to figure out how to make sense of it.
I think that's absolutely spot on, Dr. Cairo, where it's right now it's just becoming a, if you do this, then we do that. And it's just a competition essentially, right? Somebody says Black Lives Matter and they say, well, we're going to fund more police departments then, right? As a response to saying, no, all lives matter and this is what's going to happen, right? Like you said, and then trans folks and their issues and what's happening. And especially now we're talking about trans folks in sports and education and things like that. And says, okay, well, then we're going to turn around and do something that's even more detrimental to that. And the difference is that we try to say our life is important, or we try to say race is important. We try to say that queer identity is important. We try to say all these other things, but since they are the ones in power, the power structures then say, well, we're going to do something to undercut that completely because we're the ones in power, and frame it as victimhood, right? Oh, so our whiteness is under attack, and our white livelihood and our heroic history, et cetera, is under attack. When in reality, they still have the power to say, well, we're going to cut that all out. So we started tearing down some statues of, Confederate leaders and slave owners, things like that, and said, okay, fine, take those statues down. Guess what? Now we're going to go against critical race theory, so you can't talk about it in schools, right? You can't talk about why you tore down those statues, for example. So it really is this kind of back and forth overall. I'd like to move into something a little bit, just because we're getting close to our time, and I really wish we could talk about this for hours on end. Unfortunately, we do talk about it for hours on end, but unfortunately today we can't really do that, logistically speaking. But I'd like to hear y'all's responses to the framework that's being built, since you kind of alluded to that, Dr. Cairo, a little bit about how it's being portrayed, right? So some of the tenets, to use our own words, or I guess use critical race theory's own words against CRT, are it sounds okay on paper, right? It'll say something like public institutions, school districts should not direct or otherwise compel students to affirm, adopt, or adhere to the fact that any race, religion, ethnicity is inherently superior or inferior to another. And so they use that language to say no one's better than each other, whereas critical race theory does teach that. At least that's how they are perceiving it, right? It also says individuals by virtue, sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, national origin are inherently responsible for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin. And this is the language that's being used to draft legislation against critical race theory, right? And if you read it without context, it says no one's better than another. And that might sound okay, but in terms of what they're actually doing and the detriments behind that, I'd like to hear what your responses are to that legislation in that language.
My response is a real simple one. If I even use a CRT lens applied to that statement, the question I will be asking is, why are we not critiquing the already existing whitening and indoctrination of the current school system and the way that it seeks to acculturate and assimilate students of non-dominant backgrounds into a white cisgendered patriarchal supremacist society? That's the way that I would reframe it. It's simply to say that you're going to get that backlash. I think Cairo hit it, right on the money. The issue is this public challenge to power, and that CRT offers a lens for people to just look at different outcomes of historical, conditions, and the way it has led to sort of this contemporary world, the way we see it, experience it, live it. So the question we should be asking is why hasn't this lawmakers challenged the way school has been taught for the last 200 or so years, all the way to now, in trying to indoctrinate our students to think in one particular way. And now that cats is getting woke and truly, challenging what is inadequate and inappropriate for school systems, it's all about the power and losing that power, or feeling like they're losing power, and they don't want to equitize and offer an equitable distribution of power across voice and across knowledge production.
To me, the statement reeks of anxiety. The logic of it is it's called a straw man argument, in which the point that's being argued, the celebration of everyone's achievements, in particular the groups that have not been recognized, is transformed into white people are evil. And so it's easier to attack the made up straw man of demonizing whiteness than it is to attack the celebration of other people's achievements. And so we have to point out that the easy way to defend yourself against that is just to ask, who and where are you seeing people saying that white people are evil, less than, whatever it is? It's just really putting the pressure on them to confirm their made up perspectives. I mean, the other thing that I thought Dr. Benitez made a very good point about is I call it this gatekeeper phenomenon. We voted Obama and everything's going to be all right. The fact is that historically it's shown up as more of the same with a little bit of sugar added. The fact that he deported, I don't care, I'll say it again, more minorities than the last 3 presidents put together, more Latinos, and has to be called out, because a lot of Latinos voted for him with the expectation that he was going to give us comprehensive immigration reform, and it didn't come, and we didn't hold his feet to the fire. So we have to put that in the hopper for next time. So I think it's important to call a spade when it comes to deliverables, because those $1 million donors to his campaign, they're not wringing their hands. They're saying, where's my return on investment? So we in our votes have to say the same thing. Where's our return on investment? So that was just something that I thought it was very important to echo. And then ultimately, I think that, again, the Republicans right now have painted themselves into a corner, and they would rather talk about anything and everything except the mess that they've made for themselves by hitching their, star to a wagon of hate and racism and bigotry. They did that to themselves, and now they're like, let's talk about critical race theory as the evil. And you just have to call them on it, right? The real hate, right? The technique that the campaign used, that the Trump campaign was, if you called them corrupt, they would say you're corrupt. If you call them pedophiles, you're a pedophile. If you call them on and on. So what's happening is, because people are calling them on their hatred, now they're looking around for a place to call hateful. And they settled on critical race theory. But if you remember, it was gay people going to get married, the world's going to end if you let this happen, right? There's always like this boogeyman kind of, let's find something a shiny object to distract people from the fact that we are a mess. So that's my take on the Republicans and Trump in a nutshell.
Yeah, I just real quick, but I want to add, Guillermo, también, that when we frame it like that, I think we don't also mark the role that other parties have had in enabling and continuing to permeate. If we look at so much of the bills, even in the Democratic side, and who voted where and how, their inability to also share power has made it easier for those who want to control. And, I suggest a book by Walter Mignolo, To the Point of Post-Colonialism, around the coloniality of power and subaltern knowledges. But I say that to say that it's important that we look at the system, both Republican, Democrat, and any other parties alike, unless it is a straight anti-racist agenda. Because even if we were to look at like the Green Party, for example, when Cynthia and Rosa ran, man, that was a hell of a ticket. But once Jill Stein and others started to step in there, they started to ease up a little bit again, right? Because that's scary to think about the ways in which we're implicated and how we continue to permeate and enable the systems to stay alive and to evolve into different types of things like microaggressions, which is another way of saying racism.
What I would add, Chris, on that statement is that when that part about we're not going to make anyone else feel guilty about what they did in the past, right? That is a direct protection of white individuals and white supremacy, right? So that we don't name it. Pass that shit. Pass it. It's whatever. But it doesn't keep us from talking about history, right? I don't need to talk about make people feel guilty or say, you know, what they perceive to be, what they imagine to be like, you're white, you should feel bad for the atrocities of slavery, whatever, right? Because we're not doing that. What we are doing is going back to, you know, what was said, you know, in terms of the critical thinking, looking at history, right? My partner this morning, he's like, he learned something, which was, and he shared it with me because, you know, I didn't know. He's like, did you know the banjo has its roots and you know, and bringing from Africa and slavery, and then the tapping on the banjo was actually a connection to native peoples because they were banned from banging the drums, right? And so that turns later on appropriated, turns into bluegrass, what, you know, many people love. So I will continue talking about the components of history and the connections of oppression and how it showed up, right? I don't have to directly necessarily tell my students, you are responsible for this, because no one's doing that, right? I don't need to name those parts to continue to say, this is how history, you know, has by design excluded people, right? And it doesn't change the classroom, and that's what I'm going back to. It doesn't change the values, it doesn't change the critical thinking, it doesn't change the conversations that we need to have in order to have individuals who move through the world with, you know, care and justice for other individuals, right? So that the bill, as the ways that is written, you know what, pass it. Because it doesn't actually keep us from doing our job as educators. And actually, now that I'm saying that out loud, let me actually edit a part. Because I do also know, and I have colleagues and professors who their life and they're CRT scholars and they teach it, right? And it is very personal. And it is also, it feels like a very direct attack on the way in which we teach and view the world. So maybe my flippantness of saying pass it, maybe let's not maybe go there, because it does affect people directly, but it doesn't actually change how we teach, is what I'm trying to say.
I think it's a very important point because there are ways to still be anti-racist in a classroom and outside of a classroom, where we can talk about these things without mentioning necessarily CRT, right? And so you're right, we don't want it to pass, but if it does, there are alternatives to that. Due to time constraints, I kind of want to move on just a little bit, if that's okay with everybody. Before we turn it over to question and answers from the audience, I'd like to ask each of you to briefly give us, on the note that Dr. Caro was talking about, a kind of call to action. Those of us who are supporters of critical race theory, those of us who do equitable work and equitable anti-racist work in our daily lives, both in the community and higher education and beyond, what is something that you might recommend briefly that we can continue to do?
Given that this is a space of education, I'll be brief. Read any and everything and all readings from Gloria Ladson Billings, who is the one who took critical race theory from out of critical legal studies and really began to bring it into the world of education as a framework for teaching and learning, and probably some of the most valuable books on teaching that exist out there.
I just wanted to say that my training early on was in Marxism, and I feel like as I get older, I haven't been able to shake it. And this little anecdote might help the future scholars in the room. So Marx was criticized for reading Mill's or John Wealth of Nations, and they were like, this is diametrically opposed to everything that you are espousing. What are you doing that? And he says, because I want, in short, because my model needs to be tested, I need to test it against the most articulate anti in order to galvanize it. So my advice is, yes, absolutely read the Crenshaws, read absolutely, but also you don't need to read any scholarship opposing it, but you do need to listen to people's perception of what they think it is. either to understand the misperception or to say, I'm going to test that because that claim might be true. I'm going to go. And there's nothing wrong with galvanizing our steel, meaning once you galvanize steel, it becomes 10 times stronger, right? So don't be afraid to test and question, especially if you're young. Now is the time to see, where you really are, and not to run away with the first guy on a bike and abs.
That was a great visual. Thank you. uh, I guess I will add this part, right? In terms of I echoed all the readings and the doing. I was at a lecture when I was an undergrad. Laura Latson-Billings was speaking, and she shared the story about how students were like, "What am I going to learn as a white student from CRT?" She's like, "Okay." She walks out of the room. The point being that there are many things to teach, right? There's much knowledge to share from this component, right? And I think that is such a another powerful visual about how knowledge, thinking together, critical thinking, right? How it is collective and how it changes. And that's the thing that we need to continue to elevate. But the part that I will end with is that elevated by not decentering the experiences of people of color and marginalized people, right? I think this moment is asking for a unity in what it feels like and it is a very direct assault on our lives. But to say everybody benefits from this, right, would move us into a caution that comes from CRT, which is that interest convergence, right? We want to make sure that we bring in that white people benefit from this, that structures of power benefit from this. And that, I think that's a cautionary tale that we see through many, of the scholars who write on CRT. And so, yes, let's find solidarity, but let's not decenter and elevate the voices of those who are marginalized and those who are continuing to be disenfranchised by our systems right now.
Absolutely. Thank you for those actionable items. I think those are some things that some of us can do, right? And when it comes to finding that community and it comes to finding those books, the folks here are definitely great resources for that. But at the same time, I want to pick your brains a little more from the audience. So I'd like to turn it over for questions and answers. I know we're kind of over time, but if people are okay with that, we'll stay a few more minutes just to make sure that we really address what everybody's thinking based on the conversation today. So if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to allow for capabilities to unmute yourselves, or you can put your questions in the chat and you can ask it that way. So I'd like to turn it back over to our participants today for our live discussion. Some people saying they have to leave, which is totally fine. Andrea, thank you so much for being here today with us and your contributions in the chat. While people are coming up with questions, and again, feel free to unmute yourselves at any point and speak up.
Then Chris, I'll just offer a quick disclaimer. Hey, people out there, I know I'm the VP of EDI and I use these, but let me let y'all know that I speak for me and me only, and the people that I advocate for. I do not represent the voices, disclaimer, of my university. And so I just wanted to be clear that my voice is not MSU Denver's voice. I serve as their VP, but I'm speaking on my own terms as Mike B.
Thank you for that. And I believe the same can be said for the folks in the room here today. We kind of agreed that this will be a interinstitutional discussion, but really from the voices of the people doing the work, not necessarily representative of the institution itself. So I do believe that that's a good point to make. And again, as I said in the beginning, as you can see here, we did attempt to have different representation and different voices at the table. Unfortunately, it didn't happen the way we would like to, right? The people here have provided amazing wisdom, amazing knowledge, amazing contributions to this work of critical race theory, but we do know that this conversation has to continue with more voices present. So with that being said, one more time, I do want to turn it back over to see if anybody has questions from our audience. Linda is asking, what is Save the Kids doing with kids in this area? I think that one, perhaps I could turn it over to Anthony if you want to talk about Save the Kids a little more and what's going on there.
Sure. I think we need to, like, as you all brilliant minds have discussed, I think the issue is, why is this a youth justice issue? And it's so fundamental. So two parts. critical race theory comes from critical thinking, which comes from critical theory, which comes from the Frankfurt School, right? Herbert Marcuse, Eric Fromm, so we need to understand what is highly problematic. And I was in a meeting with other faculty members a few years ago, and somebody said, which is highly problematic, and it's colonialism at its best. How do you define critical thinking? How do you define critical theory? Basically eliminating citations whatsoever, right? So eliminating the history of one's knowledge, eliminating all the people. So how do you define intersectionality? Like, wait a second, there is a definition. It was founded in 1989 by Kim Crenshaw. Like it's mute. Like there's no debate. Like there is a definition. If you don't like it, then create another definition. But I think that is what's dangerous about people redefining these things. The Trump era has created this idea of not critically thinking, creating a dogmatic framework of how we live, right? That anti-intellectualism is something that we should support, and being an academic is very elitist and very detached. And I think he's promoting that framework. So is everyone else, right? And the world is flat, right? Like, so we're getting like the first academic repressed person was Copernicus, right? Like saying the world is round, right? Like, no, flat, and we're going to think it that way. And I think that's the dilemma, is what we are in is an era of academic repression and dogmatism, right? And then the other part is Black Lives Matter is providing the feet to the fire and demanding that people take accountability. Well, if you can't say race, Black, white, racial justice, anything, because it's going to be against the law, critical race theory, then it doesn't allow anybody to demand accountability or reparations. So that's like, there's a number of people that are very fearful that tomorrow will be reparations. And also part of reparations is accountability. And so if you can't speak about that, then nobody needs to take accountability or reparations. So how does that help youth? Well, we're talking about how the world will be tomorrow. And everybody on this panel, Daniel, Michael, everyone, okay, are discussing the future. And I think that is what we're looking at, is a dogmatistic, non-thinking, I have to take a test in the near future about being a better professor. And part of it is copying and pasting the answer of what it means to be, what is evaluations, right? And I'm like, wow, so we're not even like, so there's no such thing as copyright anymore or plagiarism. They want you to plagiarize. So I think that's the dilemma, where we need to fight for critical thinking. So we don't create a rubricization of society. And so in closing, from my comments, is that we want our youth, everybody on this panel, everybody in this room, to be free and liberated. You cannot be free and liberated if the abuser cannot and does not take accountability, and where the youth is not liberated and free. So if that makes sense.
Anthony, I want to add to your point, because the one piece that we haven't touched on that is significant and central to CRT and other anti-oppressive theories is material transformation. If we're not putting out the resources and standing behind it so that the changes can happen, to your point, then the idea of accountability and what we should really be talking about, reparations, goes out the door. So that material transformation piece, so key to organizations like the one you're getting down with.
Thank you both for those
Just
points.
to, Chris, I just wanted to add really quick, nobody on this panel is paid. Everyone volunteered their time and their sweat equity to be on this panel. And that's what Save the Kids is really about, is a fully volunteer organization with about $1,000 in its account. So it goes back to the movement. Nobody makes money on oppression on this panel.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing too many questions in the chat overall. So I think we might be wrapping up here. So first of all, I think we talked about a lot of things within critical race theory and outside of critical race theory that have to do with what's happening at the national level and what's happening globally at the same time. And I think all of these topics can definitely be expanded and even become their own sessions, their own workshops, and their own panels at some point. But we definitely want to continue the conversation as we go. And actually, it looks like somebody does have a question from Grace. If you can unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Buenos dias. Thank you guys for being here. I'm happy to have been listening to you, and I feel like a lot of what you addressed talks a lot about the higher learning as well as the K through 12 criticisms and debate that is happening right now. But what I feel like I am noticing in the current conversation, or what I'm noticing a lack of, is actually youth voice. So I was wondering if you guys might have any comments around that, because what I see a lot of and what gets put a lot of emphasis are these parents that are very upset. And, and of course they're backed by the political powers that be, but I'm not seeing those kids come up crying saying, I feel like a bad person because I'm white. I'm not actually seeing the kids. I'm seeing upset parents. And so I'm just wondering if you might have anything to offer on that critique of, like, this is about youth justice and youth empowerment, and there are no youth being uplifted, or if there are, I'm not seeing them. So if you guys wouldn't mind kind of commenting on that before we go, I appreciate you.
Excellent question. Thank you. Panelists?
Yeah, no, I mean, Grace, you hit it. You hit so much of it on the money. There's not much to add to what you said, really. In terms of when you look at movements across the nation right now, from Black Lives Matters to trans to anti to migrant movements, so many of those are led by the youth, for the youth and for others. When you look at movements historically, most movements have been led largely by youth, by young people trying to create a better tomorrow. And I think that today we're seeing a replica of that with today's youth, who are, again, right, challenging us, post-young people, to use the words of Jeff Chang, post-young, never old, just post-young, to not only stay the course and not get caught up in the wave, but to also, stick to our advocacy and us advocating and carving space for youth to be them, and to continue to uplift and empower themselves and build that agency around these areas. But outside of that, Grace, I think you hit it right on the money with that one. So I ain't got much to add really to what you offered as a point of analysis and critique.
I also want to affirm both, what was said. So thank you, Grace, for bringing that up. The only thing that I would have to add, though, is that I think our young people are also not monolithic, right? Our youth are also not monolithic, right? We just saw how other youth, through chips at predominantly Latino, Latinx, right? Latinx kids that they were playing, right? We're hearing chanting about build the wall, right? We're hearing about those things. And I would say that they're taking the cue from what is happening politically, right? And so I do think that there's an urgency to engage by all youth, but also talk about them in more complicated ways, than the ways in which we also talk about people, right? And so I will continue to say that I am thankful for and grateful, and then also it's a call to action, that a cue that I get from young people. Our institutions are changing, and I would attribute it to them, right? Yes, it's the scholars that are putting out some work, but it's really young people who are pushing us to think differently about what our institutions look like. And so, I agree with the points that you raised.
Thank you
Hey,
for that.
Grace, real quick, Chris, sorry. I just
Go ahead.
wanted to say, I always start my semester lectures with an apology to my young students for mortgaging their future and their kids' future. And I tell them, your grandkids are going to be paying for my car that I've borrowed money on. I've mortgaged you and I apologize. But the reason why I do that is to make it clear that I embrace the responsibility that my generation has made a mess of things and that it's going to be their responsibility, unfortunately, to clean it up. And so, to your point, I think that it's the youth where the hope is. And what we're doing is we're trying to make the space for them to, have an easier time. And it's happening. I mean, that's where the revolution comes from the youth. And so I'm glad that you've pointed that out about where are the youth in this, because they're the ones that are going to have to execute and respond to a lot of the things that we've done, both good and bad.
This, sorry, just another bit. I just heard this story on, yesterday they were talking about like, whoa, people don't want to return to work because they realize, wait a minute, you're killing me with all those hours, right? I actually want to enjoy life. That's another cue that young people are talking about, the way in which we structured working hours and what does it mean to give your labor. That doesn't work anymore, right? So when we're talking about dismantling systems of power, neoliberalism, breaking the status quo of, of what does it mean to give your labor, young people are also saying, you know what? We're not going to participate in that. And we're going to take our cue from, right, coming out of this pandemic, telling us that we want to enjoy, we want to live our lives. And all of a sudden, other people are going, maybe I can also resist this and say, you know what? I'm not going to give you 60 hours out on my week anymore.
Absolutely. I think those
Hey,
are
I just,
all.
sorry, Chris, last thing. I just dropped the
Yes,
link.
Guillermo. Go ahead.
Sorry about that, because I've written about youth. So Grace, if you click on that link, you'll see some pedagogical tools there directed at youth.
Thank you. Yes, what I was about to say is that in Save the Kids, we try to focus on that. In fact, Save the Kids, the organization itself, was named by the youth that we were attempting to ask, what is it that needs to happen in society? What is it that needs to happen for you all to feel like there is change and transformative justice actually happening? And part of it was, let's name the organization about us, Save the Kids. It wasn't some scholarly academic thing, and so we went with that, right? And so some of the tenets that we use, or some of the components, like Anthony mentioned at the very beginning, are we take some things that students and youth are already into, things they're already interested in, and take it and put themselves in that curriculum. For example, what Anthony put in the chat right now, lowriders and hip hop, right? I currently serve as a chair for the International Lowrider Studies Conference. And what we do there is we bring folks from all over. In fact, Guillermo participated in that. Thank you for that again. Is we bring different individuals to talk about lowriders, the vehicles that bounce, right? For those who aren't familiar, in a simplified term, right? But of course, it's more than just that. But we talk about the things that they want to do, that they see in the streets, that they have seen as something negative, from the police, from the media, from misrepresentation, all kinds of areas. And then we say, but actually, this is a cultural expression and representation of you and your culture, your history, your background. So then we view critical race through the lens of lowriders, right? Same thing we do in hip hop. We have a hip hop studies area where we're focusing on that and saying, if you're already into this, hip hop has already influenced your life and our culture in such a way, let's talk about it critically, and let's talk about how the youth are the ones leading these movements. So that's part of the discussion overall, among many other things. I do want to kind of have us wrap up a little bit here. Again, I would love to have this conversation all day long, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, we do have to wrap up here. So I do want to thank each and every one of you for your wisdom, for your thoughts, for your actions, for the work that you do on a daily basis to keep these conversations happening, to keep this work, and to credit the youth and credit the folks who are behind these movements overall. Please continue to do that. Please let us know how we can collaborate and continue these discussions. So with that, the last thing we want to say is please visit savethekidsgroup.org to learn more about what we do and about the individuals here. And also you can find out there how to volunteer, how to donate, how to get involved, how to expand our resources as a whole. So thank each and every one of you very much. Thank you to the audience for participating, for your questions, for your comments, for some debate, it looks like in the chat as well. That's very appreciated. And we hope everybody has enjoyed this conversation, has a wonderful rest of the day, rest of the week. Thank you.
Right on. Chris, Daniel, Guillermo, Anthony, a pleasure to throw down with y'all. To the people that came out, deuce.
Yep. Nice to meet you all. Ciao. Bye.
Thank you.